He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience. And together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we're really privileged today to have a special guest all the way from London, Paul Feldwick. He's a former account planner with some legacy agencies in London, and the author recently of 2 books, The Anatomy of Humbug, which came out in 2015, and a brand new book this year called Why Does the Peddler Sing? And the subtitle is What Creativity Really Means in Advertising. So we're going to have a great conversation. Let's join Paul. Okay, Henry, we're back with another episode, and I'm really excited about having Paul Feldwick as our guest. I came across Paul's work when he published his The Anatomy of Humbug, and the subtitle was, or is, Thinking Differently About Advertising. Did I get that right, Paul?
More or less. It was 2015, and it was How to Think Differently About Advertising. But
How to Think Differently. Okay. And that's when I first came across him. And a friend of mine, a creative director in Paris named J.F. Fournon, who I've known for some time, said, you must read Paul's book because he had some interesting things to say about the single-minded proposition. And I was in the midst of writing my book, How to Write a Single-Minded Proposition, when I came across your book, and you had completely different thinking about that. And I, as a good teacher, I thought I was being a good teacher. I wanted to share your thinking, even though it was different from my own, in my book. And you gave me the supreme compliment by saying that was very brave, which I appreciated. So, Paul, we're very happy to have you as our guest on the Brief Brothers. And why don't you just take a moment and give us a little background on your role in advertising, because you've worked with some of the giants in the business.
Well, I've been very lucky. I joined an ad agency called Bose Massimi Pollitt in 1974, which at that time was a sort of small but rapidly growing agency in London that already had a very impressive show reel of very creative but also very popular, very entertaining work that used a lot of humor, a lot of cartoons, a lot of music, etc. And I stayed with that agency for 30 years. Now, the agency changed a lot during that time. First of all, it got a whole lot bigger. And then at some point along the line, it merged with DDB and became part of the global DDB network. And of course, that had impacts on the way we worked. And I think, to be honest, as time went on, we lost some of the magic sauce that we'd had earlier on. But by then, I was actually spending an awful lot of my time in departure lounges, flying around the world, meeting people from other DDB offices and having a great time with most of them. So, I didn't really take too much responsibility for that. But I mean, I guess my fascination with advertising was, has continued ever since then. And I mean, I left the agency 15 years ago or more, and I continue to be fascinated by the business. That's why I've written 2 books about it. I continue to like to be in touch with what's going on and talk to people and argue with people about what's going on. And I do a bit of consultancy work as well. So I think, advertising and how it works has occupied me, usefully and pleasantly for a large part of my life.
Could you just take a moment and summarize the main argument of Anatomy of Humbug and then your newest book, Why the Peddler Sings?
Sure. Anatomy of Humbug, as you say, it was a critique of what I saw as the dominant model of how advertising works, which is pretty much the single-minded proposition model. And I mean, it has variations, but just about everybody's creative brief form has, if it doesn't actually say single-minded proposition, it finds another way of clearly insinuating pretty much the same thing. There's one box in the middle and you're only allowed to use 8 words or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And I became more and more skeptical about this. Not that it never applies to advertising, but I mean, I wanted to critique the underlying assumptions behind that model, because the underlying assumptions are somehow that advertising works by changing people's minds, that it works by transmitting a message, and that message has to be short and simple, and that message is basically verbal, and therefore there is a kind of rational persuasion that's assumed to be going on. And that thinking, in one way or another, which I labeled the salesmanship model, because that's where I think it can be traced back to, right back in the early 1900s, when John Kennedy said advertising is salesmanship in print. And Claude Hopkins then built on that, and Ogilvy then, of course, built on Claude Hopkins, and Rosser Reeves built on Claude Hopkins. And these things became sort of set in kind of tablets of stone in the advertising industry, so that they structured the way people think. And of course, they structure the way people act. So they structure the way a brief is written. They structure the whole idea of having a brief, to be honest. They structure the way people evaluate advertising, the way they judge advertising. They structure the kind of research that is done. So, you know, when an idea gets embedded in a culture like that, it becomes very, very hard to shift, because people are no longer thinking, should we do it this way or should we do it that way? They've now got this cultural mindset that says, this is the way we do it, because this is the way it's always been done. And anybody who thinks it should be done a different way is either bad or mad. So it becomes quite difficult to push against. But I had to go because, as I say, I thought that is one model, and sometimes it's useful, and sometimes it explains very well what advertising is doing. But it didn't fit terribly well with most of my experience working in advertising, where we had produced ads that seemed to be much more important that they were entertaining, that they were memorable, that they used visual images, that they used music, that they used emotional response, all very, very different from this kind of simple, rational, verbal formula that was supposed to underpin what you were doing. And I suppose a lot of people in advertising, they sort of reconcile those two realities by kind of going, well, at the core of it, we're transmitting a message. But of course, there's a good way of doing that, which is you dress it up a bit, and that makes it more memorable, and that makes it gets attention so that people will listen to you. And I think it's more radical than that. I think that actually advertising also works in other ways apart from this rational persuasion model. And so in the Anatomy of Humbug, I reviewed various different ways of explaining it. And I won't go through them all now because they are there in the book. But I mean, what they all have in common is that they are sort of working in ways that are not primarily verbal, not primarily rational. So, for example, I mean, the old hidden persuaders theories about subconscious manipulation, which became sort of such a hot potato that the ad industry then kind of quickly forgot about them and reverted to Rosser Reeves saying, you know, there are no hidden persuaders. Advertising works in the bare, pitiless sunlight, and all we're doing is we're honest salesmen, you know, giving you facts about the product. So that kind of rebounded on itself, if you like. But I mean, to take another way of thinking about it, something that my first boss, Martin Bowes of Bowes Massimi Pollitt, said to me when I started in the business in the 1970s. And he said, well, the reason our ads are entertaining is because we believe that if you're going to invite yourself into somebody's living room for 30 seconds, you have a duty not to shout at them or bore them or insult their intelligence. But if you are a charming guest, if you provide something that is entertaining or at least sufficiently interesting to them, they will like you better. And if they like you better, they'll be a bit more likely to buy your brand. Now, at the time, that was so different from everything that was kind of regarded as conventional wisdom that I didn't take it terribly seriously, but it stuck in my mind. And as the years went on, I began to think more and more that this was actually very profound, and also that it could be backed up from a whole lot of other theoretical viewpoints if you wanted to make it sound more respectable. So I now think that probably has as much to do with it, and possibly more to do with it, than the rational persuasion model. That's why, and I'm leaping ahead now to talk a bit about my second book, because yes, it really does build on this idea. It's called Why Does the Peddler Sing? Because I was fascinated by this figure of the sort of medieval traveling peddler. was triggered by a passage in The Winter's Tale, which I was reading, where the peddler arrives and the servant comes in very excitedly saying, "Oh, master, if you did but hear this peddler at the door, you know, you'd never believe there was anything so wonderful, because he sings all these ballads and songs, and he's the best thing ever." And the guy says, "Okay, great, bring him in and tell him to come in singing." So I was thinking, this is quite interesting, because a peddler isn't just a traveling entertainer. He's actually there to sell stuff. But these two things go together and they absolutely support each other. Now, why is that? It's not just about getting attention, although that's the start of it. You know, it's also about getting invited in. You know, I mean, imagine what it was like in the days before, you know, there was any such thing as recorded music, never mind broadcast music. The only way you would hear music was if somebody actually turned up singing songs. So this is quite a big event. Somebody turns up singing songs and they sing, and if they sing well, they're going to go, "Hey, you know, come into our house and spend a bit of time here. We'd like to hear your songs." And obviously at some point, I don't know which way around it worked, and it probably worked both ways, but at some point in time, and I think a long way back, the singers and the traveling entertainers realized that they could make more money if they had something to sell, rather than just passing the hat round and saying, you know, give us a few pennies for the song. So they'd have some ribbons or something to sell. Or else the peddlers who were walking around from house to house trying to sell their ribbons realized that they sold a whole lot more ribbons if they could sing or do something like that, because they'd get invited in. And because when they got invited in, they would then build this relationship. They would do exactly what Martin Bowes was talking about a TV commercial doing. They come into your living room, they put a smile on your face, they put you in a good mood, they create a relationship. And then, you know, you sort of automatically think, "Oh, I'd love to buy some of those beautiful ribbons, don't they look great?" And I mean, they might even have been singing songs about the ribbons, which is what the peddler does in The Winter's Tale, you know. So he's kind of invented the TV commercial several hundred years before TV was invented. But I wanted to use that image, I suppose, to build up my argument that although it's glaringly obvious that throughout the history of modern advertising, so much of it has used all the tropes and devices of popular entertainment. You know, it uses humor, it uses song and dance, it uses music, it uses, you know, sort of entertaining use of language, it uses drama, it uses sex appeal, it uses all these things in the service of selling. And, you know, we've never really talked about that openly in the ad business. It's like, oh, yeah, we do that, but it's a bit tacky, it's a bit vulgar. And actually, what we're really doing here is we're selling stuff, because we are serious professional, you know, marketing sales people. And we just do this because it makes it a little bit more, you know, gets a bit more attention or something like that. I wanted to turn that on its head and say, actually, when you look at so many of those great brand building campaigns, right from the very start of brand building in the late 19th century, you find that, you know, brands are not built on somebody having a product difference or explaining why their product is better. They are simply built on the principle of, I am putting on a show and I'm making sure that as many people as possible hear about this show, so that I just dominate the market. I become more famous than anybody else, that people actually like what I'm doing and feel good about it. And then the sales follow. And in the book, I take a couple of examples. I take the origins of Quaker Oats, and I take the origins of Coca-Cola. And I could have taken probably any number of other brands, even including the ones that one thinks might be more product-based, like Nike or Apple. And I think the same points would be made, that brands are built by making themselves into celebrities, if you like. And that is really, as far as brand building is concerned, that is the primary function of advertising.
And what would you say has been the reaction to some of the ideas that you're positing in both books?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, I expected it to be controversial somehow, because maybe there are a lot of people who are not agreeing with it, but they've kept quite quiet. I've had very little actual pushback on this. I mean, to be honest, to come up with a proposition that say, you know, advertising needs to be popular and entertaining in order to work, doesn't seem to me a terribly controversial point of view, although some people might find it so. But I haven't had a lot of people pushing back. But what I am interested in is, and it may just be coincidence, I have a feeling I might have timed this just about right, and I might be pushing at an open door. I think a lot of other people are coming to a very similar conclusion, or there's something in the zeitgeist. But I'm noticing now, when I look on social media or whatever, that more and more people are kind of coming up with this. I was just reading a thing on LinkedIn just now by a guy who I don't know at all and may not even be aware of me or my book, saying, you know, why are jingles so out of fashion in advertising? Because they're terribly out of fashion. Yeah. They're terribly uncool. Nobody for the last 20 years has wanted to write a jingle, really, because that's not what wins awards at Cannes. That's not what's cool in the advertising village. But it still bloody well works, you know. And writing a good jingle is one of the most powerful things you can do. And there are plenty of good examples around today. If you look at them, they just don't get on into the awards juries.
Starting with a long-running jingle for State Farm, there was written lyrics by Keith Reinert, music by Barry Manilow. I mean, it's been running probably 40, 50 years, yeah. And it's become, to use the parlance of the day, a distinctive brand asset, right? And I think that part of what you're saying, I do agree that you kind of pushed on an open door. Because I think you're bringing the creative side to the discussion that Byron Sharp is bringing to the marketing science side.
That's exactly what I thought I was doing too. Yeah.
So I do, and I think if I could sum up, or what I think I'm hearing is there's a disconnect between what we think, what the theory of advertising, and what we actually do in practice, right? Like there have always been campaigns that have been entertaining, but it wasn't necessarily by design of a brief or because they set out to be entertaining. It's just through trial and error. And those are the campaigns we remember fondly. And those are the campaigns that I think what you're doing is bringing a lens to look at, and I think you had 6 different models of thinking about advertising and how it works, but nobody had a specific model except perhaps that salesmanship model in mind when they set out to do it. But if we look at the advertising retroactively through those 6 models, we could see how some of them work on different levels. You know, in that sense, I think advertising is a lot like medicine. Like most of the medical advances that we've had over the centuries have been through trial and error, not because somebody had a theory about how something worked and then went in, you know, it was just through trial and error, and then they kind of figured out, oh, this is why it works afterwards. So I think it's an exciting time, but I do agree that you're arriving at this discussion at a right time, particularly when people are looking for answers, because the state of training, we've had a couple of these episodes where we've talked about the dire state of training in ad agencies and at clients is far reduced from where it was, you know, even when I got into the business in the 90s.
Yeah, I think I would much rather be, as I put it, pushing at an open door than be a lone voice crying in the wilderness. So this is no problem at all. I mean, I think people are starting to see more and more that the pendulum has swung far too far in one direction. And this is not just about, this is not now a great debate about clients want to do boring ads with propositions and agencies want to do, you know, entertaining ads with humor and jokes. It is actually that agencies want to do stuff that's cool and pleases the advertising village. And actually, I think clients more and more are kind of going, can I actually have some popular stuff? I mean, I was talking with a marketing director of a big UK enterprise the other day, and he said he had to tell his agency the other day, he said, you know, can't you do something that's more popular? That I think clients are realizing that this is what matters. And I was really interested that you cited that State Farm campaign, which I mean, I'm not so familiar with as you are, but I have some memories of it because, of course, I knew Keith Reinhardt well when I was working at DDB, and Keith Reinhardt's history was he was running Needham, Harper and Steers in Chicago at the time that Needham Harper merged with DDB
The
to
Big
form
Bang.
2/3 of Omnicom. And of course, these agencies, they were chalk and cheese in every possible way. I mean, the Chicago agency was, gentlemanly, Midwestern, unafraid of emotion, State Farm or the work they'd done for McDonald's, very typical. Brilliant agency at creating big brand assets, long-running campaigns, brand properties, at appealing to the mass of the population of the United States, like a good neighbor, is it State Farm is there or something like that? This sort of stuff. Now, of course, if you're working in DDB in New York, this super cool, shit hot, kind of slightly edgy, Jewish run agency, this is like everything you don't want to be, because actually DDB, prior to the merger, never did that kind of work. I mean, the closest they came to it, some of the early campaigns, like maybe Avis Rent-A-Car, there was a line, and the Volkswagen campaign was a very fine campaign. But I mean, as time went on, DDB actually became less and less interested in doing any of this sort of what they would see as this corn pone stuff that Needham Harper done. And yet, you see, the received version of advertising history that everybody in creative departments endlessly repeats, totally uncritically, is DDB was the greatest agency ever. Bill Bernbach was the greatest ad man ever. And, and they single-handedly saved advertising from being dross. Now, I think there's an alternative version of the history that says, actually, even though a lot of the campaigns they did were perfectly good in themselves, that was where the rot set in. That was when advertising started trying to please itself rather than trying to please its public. And that contrast between Needham and DDB, I think, kind of epitomizes a turning point where the wrong one got the upper hand.
Well, I think that's interesting that you mentioned that. I've done a lot of research into that time period, and I got to know Keith a little bit because I worked at a DDB agency here in Miami, Alma DDB, on the McDonald's business, and they brought him in to brief us.
Arthur Ensua.
Yes, of course. She was my boss and my mentor, and I was supposed to have dinner with her last Tuesday, but we switched it to this Tuesday. I'll tell her you said hello.
Please.
So yeah, she was the one that really inculcated in me a lot of I had been a self-taught planner up to the time that I joined that DDB agency, and then she took me under her wing and exposed me to a lot of the training and materials. And but I go back to, and then I revisited the whole DDB Needham merger here at my current agency because we needed to have a little bit of a rebirth, and we did it around our founder who has passed. And so, but to me was interesting was that DDB was kind of the weaker of the two agencies going into that merger, right? Like a lot of the luster had been lost.
It was in a terrible state. If that merger hadn't happened, I don't think that agency would have survived. But I've read Doris Willen's book about Bill Bernbach, Nobody's Perfect, which really tells that story with, and the decline of that agency was sad.
But to me, the brilliance was that Keith recognized that it wouldn't be about him or about Needham Harper, right? He made it about Bill Bernbach, but then he channeled that in a way that was very effective for the agency and for Omnicom, right? So I thought that was a brilliant, masterstroke was, take somebody who's dead, ascribe certain things to them and kind of create a way of thinking or a culture, which I thought was very interesting, of which I was able to experience some of the artifacts of that period during my time with DDB, which kind of brings me to my next question, and it's more related to briefing, right, and briefs, which is the usefulness of briefs, not necessarily as something that is guaranteed to get you a result, but rather something to organize thinking around. Like we talked, Howard and I, about a single-minded proposition. And for me, I think it's useful kind of as a MacGuffin in a movie, right? This thing that we're all chasing, and the action is organized around it, but what it actually says or isn't as important as the fact that it exists.
Well, maybe. I mean, I'm very interested in this subject of creative briefs, and I have got some quite skeptical views about them, to be honest, which you don't have to agree with, because I know that briefs are kind of central to.
It's okay. I mean, that's what we're here.
I mean, one thing that interests me quite a lot, and one day I am going to try and sort of explore the history of this a bit more, because there's an unknown quantity in my mind here. But certainly there was a long period in the history of advertising in which I find no mention of the creative brief at all as a document. I mean, for example, if you go back to the 50s, you like the golden age of DDB, apart from anything else, but also the golden age of a lot of other agencies, like Ogilvy and Leo Burnett doing a lot of work. I mean, there's a lot of sort of documentary evidence of what was going on in that period from books like Martin Mayer's Madison Avenue, USA.
Very cool.
If you read that book, there is no mention in that book of a creative brief. And he has actually written quite a lot about agencies' working methods and working procedures. And at no point does anybody have a creative brief. What actually happens, the process nearly always starts with a group of people getting into a room and talking together. Now, the composition of that group may vary from agency to agency. At some agencies, it's just like, the account people. At other agencies, it's the creatives and the account people, and sometimes there are researchers brought in. There are variations. But basically, there's a kind of a start work meeting, which is a conversation. And at no point is it actually said that anything is even sort of written down as an agreement from that meeting. It's like these people start talking until some kind of direction emerges. Now, I think that's, to be honest, that is still in many ways how it really works, when it works well. And I think that the rise of the creative brief can probably be dated back to the sort of, well, this is where I'm not sure, but it kind of sort of, in time terms, it's similar to the beginnings of account planning as a separate discipline.
I would say, Paul, the P that we haven't talked about, Stanley Pollitt, BMP, he's considered one of the fathers of account planning. And then I would say, wasn't he involved in developing the creative brief?
Not really. I mean, when I started working at BMP, we did have the concept of a creative brief, but our way of working was that there was no set creative briefing form. I mean, the creative brief was simply, this is the point at which the planner, having done sort of initial work on the strategy and understanding the consumer, would then sort of want to pass that knowledge onto the creative people. And, it seemed useful to write something down on a piece of paper, but we had no creative briefing form. And in fact, I mean, the way that it actually worked was much more about having a conversation than simply passing a brief over and saying, this is what you need to do. I mean, there's a very good account of this, which is actually, much of this is repeated in Why Does the Peddler Sing? An account of a particular campaign that was created in the mid-70s by John Webster. And what it's described as actually narrative creative briefing, in the sense that the planner would simply go in John's office and talk about the consumer, and John would be curious and he'd be interested because he was interested in the people he was trying to appeal to. And they talk about mums and children and breakfast cereals or whatever it was, and John would, and then at some point John would go, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. And a direction would emerge. And I mean, in my experience, that is very often how campaigns emerge. You know, the idea that it is the planner's job to write somehow a brief which is simultaneously sort of brilliant, insightful, and inspiring, you know, and they then pass it over to the creatives, who then turn it into a wonderful ad. I mean, I've actually never really seen that happen. I mean, you and I know that what happens more than half the time is the longer the planner slaves over the brief and tries to make it brilliant, the more likely the creatives are to take one look at it and go, oh, don't know what the fuck to do with that. And you know, it becomes, I mean, there are so many things wrong with this, I think. I mean, throughout the time I've been in advertising, bodies like the Account Planning Group have been running courses on writing better creative briefs, as if this was the most important thing in the world. The creative briefs have not got any better as a result. Creative briefs are never very good. I've never seen an example of a really good creative brief. I mean, sometimes they're good enough. If they get the process started, if they help start the process, if they lead to a great ad, they can be post-rationalized, whatever. I really am very skeptical about the value of the creative brief as this, you know, magical fetishized document.
Yeah, I don't know.
I get that you, but hang on a second. I want to challenge you a little bit here, Paul, because I believe that I use a creative brief from a British agency where I think you worked or were connected to, and it was for the BBC's coverage of the 2012 Olympics in London. And the agency's name is 4 letters, FGH. I'm getting it all. I'm not sure what it is. Okay. Does this ring any bells for you?
No.
I came across some piece of information that says that you were somehow affiliated with this agency, and I thought perhaps you might have seen this brief. It's a single-page brief, and I think it's and I use it as a example of a well-written brief in my book on how to write a single-minded proposition, because it's 100 words, and every creative I've ever shown it to is excited about it. So while this might be a minority, it might be a rare thing, I think they do exist.
I think.
Yeah, I'm prepared to admit that they do exist. Sometimes that's how it works. I think, in my experience, it's not that often that that's how it works.
I think,
and you know, it could have taken place as a conversation equally well, probably.
Yeah, I think
it's a big subject. I'm probably overstating my case a bit here, just because I think so much has gone wrong with our obsession with creative briefing, our obsession with making the brief somehow a brilliant document, our obsession with the idea that the brief has to be inspiring. I mean, just think for a moment. All the planners endlessly go on about, we want more training on how to write a great creative brief. And I mean, I've run those courses myself, and, you know, I've never seen it get any better as a result, and they're still asking for it. Nobody ever says, should we do a course for creatives about how to accept a creative brief, how to listen to a creative brief, how to ask the right questions? I've never heard
about that.
I mean,
we did an episode on that. That's a great idea.
Going on here, it's like the creatives are asserting their power by saying, write me a brief to inspire me, and then they can take a look at it and go, no, that doesn't inspire me. Go do it again.
Well, one of the things that I argue when I do my course is that the creatives need to be involved in the writing of the brief because they have skin in the game. And
well, then you're talking about something different. I think that's when, you know, we are recognizing that this is a dialogue, and I think that's
right. And Henry and I have had disagreements about this because he's very turf sensitive and wants to write the brief himself. And I say, no, you need to collaborate with this.
That's a mischaracterization of my point. When we talk about collaboration, we talk about at different levels. And I think that the clients will give you a brief for what they're expecting, and it's usually a miserable, horrible brief. And then I write a creative brief for the agency that I collaborate with our creative director and our creatives on. And my point is, I don't want to have to go sell that brief to the client. They already gave us their brief. I want to internalize what they gave us and put it and reduce it to the most important things, what I think are the most important things that creatives need to know, because God forbid I dump, thousands of pages of research on them and stuff that probably isn't going to lead anywhere. But I do think, and I agree with you to an extent, I think that the power of briefs has probably been overstated, but that doesn't mean that they don't have any utility at all as a start of a dialogue or a conversation.
I agree. I think, to have a conversation, to come up with some direction, to write down what you think that direction is, to hold it relatively lightly, because as the process continues, you may want to redo that 2 or 3 times. I mean, another of the dangers with the concept of the creative brief is like, that's what the brief says, that's what we've got to do. And of course, what actually happens is the brief might say one thing. As the creatives and the team start working on it, something else emerges. A new way of thinking about it comes out of that, which is better. And at that point, you can either go, okay, sod the original brief, let's build on that and write a new brief if you want to have it written down. I think that the main principle that and I think we are partially agreeing on this, of course, is that the main principle is that whether it's client and agency, or whether it's strategy department or account management and creative department internally, those relationships work better when they are actually envisaged as conversations, as dialogue, as collaborative processes, rather than I am the one who has to tell you what to do, which becomes a power game that can cut both ways. It sounds like, if I'm the one who tells you what to do, it sounds like I have the power. But actually, that can be tipped on its head very easily, because I'm going to tell you what to do, and then you're going to say, no, I can't do that.
You're sparking
up the power. And the same thing with the client relationship. I mean, the idea that you have to get a brief from the client, and the client tells us what to do, and we all sit there taking notes, and we go away and do it. I mean, that is not a great way of working. Clients don't know what to tell the agencies, so they tell them all the wrong things. So inevitably, after the client briefing session, the agency team come back and say, well, that was no use at all. We're going to have to start again and do it all ourselves. And then they go back and present to the client. And then the client goes, that's not what we told you. And there's not a dialogue. There are just these two parties who are like presenting at each other and trying to sort of show they're the ones in control. Now, we actually did evolve a way of working that was so much better than that when I was at DDB. But it never entirely caught on, and I'm not sure if it ever happens now. I mean, you may remember this, but one of the things Keith Reinhardt did sort of post the merger to try and sort of build a bridge between these two different agencies was he tried to create a sort of strategy planning format, which he called ROI, which was a sort of acronym for relevance, originality, and impact. And he got it sort of jointly written by a strategist in Chicago and a strategist in New York. And then he printed it up in a little book and he sent it all around the world. And everybody in all the DDB offices kind of went, what the hell's that? Comes from America. They stick it on the shelf or throw it in the bin. Nobody ever did anything about it. I kind of got into this situation a little bit after this, when I was sort of promoted to the role of executive creative director, and I didn't really know what my job was supposed to be, but it seemed that there was a role for somebody to be working at a network level. So I picked up this, and Keith said, why does nobody pay any attention to this lovely book that I've sent to everybody? And I said, with respect, it's not enough to just print a little book and send it to people. We have to actually have a process whereby we kind of train them to engage with this. So we built an internal training process. And I started doing some training on this ROI thing. And some offices were using it and some were not using it. Nobody seemed very excited about it. But we had a series of meetings where we brought people together from different offices around the network. And there was one meeting where we had people from, oh, I can't remember. There were several people from the States, and I think there were people from all over the world, from different offices, talking about ROI. And it was the LA office, actually, who was sort of sitting there looking very astonished at the rest of us. And they said, why aren't you all doing it the way we do it? And we said, well, how do you do it? They said, well, we thought this was the obvious way to do it. We have these questions. So we set up a day-long meeting. We invite the key client people and the key agency people to all sit in a room together. And we have a facilitator with a flip chart, and we work through these questions together. And everybody went, wow.
Well, Paul,
But actually it worked brilliantly, and I started copying it, and that's the way we started trying to train people to do it. And that for me is a very different concept.
the company that I work for and do training and writing briefs is called the Association of National Advertisers. It's a huge trade group. And yes. I work as a faculty member of the Marketing Training and Development Center.
Yeah.
And the ANA has a white paper written by their task force on creative briefs. And Henry and I have had debates about this. And this task force is comprised of CEOs and chief creative officers from some of the major members of the ANA. And this is a 17-page white paper. It's succinct, it's concise. One of the major points they recommend is exactly what you just described: a single brief written by the agency participants and the client participants. Whether it's an all-day meeting or not, I don't know, but that sounds like a good
But format. I think that's the key part of it, because having a conversation is different than creating a document that's a Frankenstein that everybody has to approve.
But that's what Paul's describing. He said there's a list of questions, and they take an entire day with members from both the client and the agency sitting down and answering these questions. It's a single document. It's not agency gets a client brief, agency responds with its own brief. And that's where there's potential for misunderstanding exists.
Very interesting, and that is very positive as far as it goes. I suspect that we need to sort of still build on that approach further, though, to get the best out of it. Because I think what I think we were working on in those meetings, and I did many of them, and they were often revelatory. I mean, clients would come out of those meetings going, "This is the first time I really felt the agency ever listened." And the client agency would come out of it going, "It's the first time I've actually understood what's going on in this client's business." I mean, there were things that could go wrong. I mean, I learned not to sort of start the meeting by asking the sort of the marketing director, you know, what are your key objectives? Because half the time they had no idea what their objectives were, and they just were made to look incredibly stupid, and that didn't get the meeting off to a good start. So you could learn some tricks of the trade about how to do it. But what I think we were doing in those meetings was we were creating a strategy, and the things that you could agree as a group, and I think they always, even so, need to be sort of agreed provisionally rather than set in stone. But, you know, what are our objectives? Business objectives. And this was really difficult. This was often the real crunch point that nobody had ever really thought about on either side. What are our business objectives and how are we going to achieve them? So that gets down to a sort of very practical question about, well, who's going to buy this product and what are they going to do with it and why? And then you can get on to why they're going to buy it and so on. But so sometimes that's really important. I mean, to take one example without going into too much detail, I mean, I worked on a campaign for mayonnaise back in the 80s. This is a long time pre-merger in the UK. Mayonnaise in the UK was a very niche product. I mean, we had a product called salad cream that was pretty disgusting, left over from the war, sort of yellow stuff with a lot of vinegar in it. And mayonnaise was just seen as a sort of posh version of salad cream. So people didn't use it very much. And if they did use it, it was only on special occasions and it was only on salad. And I had a client it was the Hellman's client in the UK, who really wanted to grow this brand. They thought it had huge potential, but they just wanted to grow it by saying, you know, posh salad cream, posh salad cream. And I did the sort of strategic thinking on that, where I said, look, you know, this is a tiny niche in the market. If you want to grow, you have most of the mayonnaise market anyway. If you want to grow Hellmann's sales, you've got to grow consumption of mayonnaise. And that means you've got to grow it beyond putting it on salad. And you've got to, because like they do in most of the rest of the world, you know, put it on chips, put it on potatoes, put it on fish or whatever, burgers, whatever you like, you know. And also you've got to make it not special occasion. You've got to make it every day. So we came up with a campaign that was actually totally radical, because it kind of debunked all these sort of shibboleths about mayonnaise. And it trebled the size of the mayonnaise category within about 18 months. So it was very, very effective. And I think it laid the foundations for Hellmann's success in the UK ever since. But so I think that's a case where there was a sort of real strategic thinking that needed to be done. And had we not done that, I suspect we wouldn't have achieved what we wanted to achieve. But actually, in so many other cases, there isn't really a particular strategic conundrum, because the task that's actually facing the advertiser is much simpler. And it is, as I try to sort of explain in the Peddler book, you know, very often the brief is really make this brand more famous. And it doesn't really matter how you make that brand more famous. If fame is the thing that you want to achieve, or mental availability, if you want to sound respectable and show you've read Byron Sharp, because we all know that's what it's about, you know, how do you build, and you made the point, you know, Byron makes this great case for mental availability. He doesn't say how do you create it. That's not, I suppose, his job. So I'm trying to build on that very much by saying, actually, if you translate mental availability to fame, how do things become famous? And we can start learning a lot of lessons then about how other things become famous. How do pop stars become famous? How do celebrities become famous? How do movie franchises or computer games become famous? Because it all happens in a similar way. And actually, you know, it is not so much to do with a sort of rational argument that says mine is better than yours. It is actually a lot more to do with showmanship and ballyhoo. And, you know, when I look at the history of, say, the Quaker brand in the early days, you know, one of the first brands, oats previously sold in barrels by the pound. Commodity market, total commodity market. Henry Crowell is the first guy who goes, we now have this technology, we can print 4-color boxes, we can put the oats into the boxes, we can brand them with this trademark that I just seem to have acquired by accident when I bought a bankrupt mill somewhere in the Midwest of a man in Quaker garb. So, which has very little to do with oats or anything else. But Crowell goes, okay, and now we just spend, and they were spending in the 1890s, they were spending $500,000 in advertising in the United States. They were using every possible medium they could get, not just, you know, I mean, there weren't that many sort of paid for media. They were doing merchandise, they were doing shows, they were doing events. They would charter special trains with a 15-foot figure of Mr. Quaker standing on top of the engine. I mean, basically, they were following all the devices of P.T. Barnum in his campaigns, and they were following, to a large extent, the sort of the techniques of the traveling medicine shows, which were very unrespectable, you know, and nobody, you know, in a serious business wanted to think we're going to do that sort of thing. But Crowell suddenly realized that he could. And he would, because it worked, and that built Quaker into, you know, the dominant brand in the oats market, the most profitable brand in the oats market, and was the foundation of the brand, and indeed the massive company that still exists today. But very little of this, I mean, some of it was to do with, obviously, part of it is saying this is why our oats are good, and these are things you can do with our oats, and all this useful sort of stuff, which is all part of it. But actually, what makes it stick in people's minds is this sense of theatre, this sense of, you know, spectacle and ballyhoo that makes Mr. Quaker into a sort of famous celebrity, and that's what brands are built on. So I mean, to come back to your question about briefing, if that's the kind of task that the agency is tasked with doing, if that's what they need to do, there isn't often a lot to be gained by spending too much time sort of angels dancing on the head of a pin, looking into the strategic this and that, and the ins and outs of the consumer and all this other stuff, other than to maybe get some ideas of something that might go, at this particular point in time. And of course, that from that point of view, it's very useful. But it's much more, the process is much more akin to saying, how are we going to create the next super hit TV show? And it's that sort of mindset that I want to encourage agencies to get. And I think, so let me wind back a bit. I mean, not to say that there is no place for a creative brief, and sometimes they are important, sometimes they're perhaps not very important. I think they have a lot of shortcomings, but actually we need to get over the idea that this is somehow the crucial, critical thing. I mean, Pixar did not create Toy Story by writing a brilliant creative brief for a movie. I mean, at some point, somebody would have written a synopsis, a treatment, and then they would have rewritten it probably several hundred times. And then an army of people worked on this in an iterative, collaborative way over a long period of time, which is painful and difficult and hard work. But that's why they come up with a great movie. It wasn't that they just came up with it. It wasn't that somebody just wrote a brilliant idea. Hey, how about a story about some toys that come to life and talk? As if I'd never heard of this idea before. And let's call it Toy Story. But the thing that matters is turning that into reality.
Yeah. Paul, thank you so much for being part of our show. You've helped make the Brief Brothers a little bit more famous, and we appreciate that very much. And we'd love to have you come back.
Say that controversy is always a good way of creating fame. If you can get people arguing about something, so if some people love you and some people hate you, it's a good way to become famous.
I have found your books to be extremely enlightening.
Yes.
They've changed the way I've been in the business 25 years. They've changed the way that I'm thinking about how advertising works. And a lot like how Byron Sharp's book changed the way that, I'm trying to bring these things into practice, and I like Howard, I want to thank you for being generous with your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure and a dream to have you. Why does the peddler sing?
Sure.
And we will post images of your books and with links on our YouTube page so that our viewers can find your books on Amazon. And we hope we can have you back to continue this conversation. We could go on and on. It's
certainly up for another one if you care to. So.
All right, Henry. We're going to do our creative review again this week, and for our creative this time around, we're going to look at a spot from Budweiser in collaboration with a charity organization called Direct Relief. For Budweiser, it's called Go Forth America. Let's take a look.
Good afternoon. In less than a week, we hope to fire up our grills and launch one of the biggest 4th of July celebrations in the history of the United States. The United States. Those words have new meaning for us all today. And whether you drive a pickup or a hybrid, you live in the heartland or on the coast, or whether you pronounce it America or Murica, we're all Americans. Seldom on the same page, but reading from the same book. On holidays, anyway. Perhaps it's fate that this 4th of July, we gotta once again come together to lend a hand to those less fortunate whose fate still lies in the balance. We're fighting for freedom for all, not from alien invaders. From separation, from being cooped up while baking bread and ignoring basic hygiene. The time has come for us to get fresh, gather the crew, and eat veggie and meat burgers till we sweat. And then let's work together towards a future where everyone can come to the party. And should we win the day, The 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday, but as the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will fill the sky with so much light and freedom, this thing will rue the day it ever messed with us. Together, we celebrate our Independence Day. Go forth, America.
Okay. This was a short film, 2.5 minutes.
Or a
And
long film, depending on.
yeah, I guess, depending upon your attention span. So what were your initial take? What'd you think?
I think there's a lot to dissect, obviously, in a 2.5 minute film. Obviously, Bill Pullman reprising his role as the president of the United States from the movie Independence Day, had Will Smith in it. It's interesting. Obviously, this is a kind of pulling on the heartstrings of most people's sense of Americana, which is interesting at this point in time with so much debate about America, whether America is a just and good country and so forth. And obviously, Budweiser has always been a brand really associated with Americana. So to me, it signals that they're doubling down on that and saying more people believe in America than don't believe in America. And so to me, that was a really interesting thing that Budweiser is bringing forth here. They've never been shy about wrapping themselves up in the flag. I'm thinking about the famous Clydesdale commercial where the Clydesdales kind of bowed toward ground zero after 9/11. Things like that Budweiser has been known to do, and to participate with the big national holidays and the big kind of pop cultural moments like the Super Bowl. So them kind of doing this 4th of July homage to the country and a kind of a rallying cry post-pandemic seems appropriate for the brand. And I don't know that a lot of other brands could pull it off. Maybe there are brands that have like a latent patriotism, like Sam Adams. Basically, the idea was that he was a patriot and a brewer, but that hasn't been their positioning, right? They're not positioned as an all-American brand. They're positioned as a craft beer and so forth. So this feels right for Budweiser. I couldn't really see any of the other American brands pulling it off as well as Budweiser did. How do you see it, Howard?
In my creative brief writing training, I ask a question of participants based on a quote from Albert Einstein. Einstein, and some people have said that Einstein didn't say it, but whatever. The line is, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. So the challenge I offer to my participants is, explain your brand to a 6-year-old, then in a language that a 6-year-old would understand. Don't explain your category, don't explain your product, explain your brand. In other words, don't explain a basketball team, explain the Miami Heat, the LA Lakers, the Chicago Bulls. And that stumps a lot of people because it's easier to explain a brand, a category or a product than it is to explain those unique things that come together to make a brand. This is my long, rather circuitous way of saying that this is clearly in the Budweiser voice. If you were to ask the question, what is the Budweiser brand, and explain it to a 6-year-old, my answer would be, go forth, America. Watch this spot. This explains the brand. So you made a really good point. There aren't too many brands out there that could pull this off because they don't have a history of doing this kind of emotional, tugging at the emotional heartstrings, and yet, poking fun here and there about hygiene and bakery and how you say the name America. So they're chuckling at some of our foibles and our oddities, and yet bringing us together in a way that we all get. They just pull it off really well. I was very impressed.
Yeah, I think if I had to put it on a brief, I'd say it's an American beer. It's the American beer with an American sense of humor.
Yeah.
And the commercial really does a nice way of bringing all that together in one element. To your point, there's like little places where you chuckle at what he says, right? But and other places, and I have to be honest, this is super corny. The first time I saw it, toward the end, I got a little bit emotional because I am one of those people that bleeds red, white, and blue. So this kind of does activate a latent patriotism
Yep.
in people. Even though you know it's a fictional character, you know he's reprising this role. You want to be inspired. You want to have this, and it makes you, and the humor of it makes you see that Budweiser kind of also gets it. You know, like we're not taking ourselves that seriously either. We're Americans, and we should all be very proud of that. But we should also be able to laugh together.
You know, I agree. Sometimes I get upset when brands try to leverage or take advantage of something that has nothing to do with them. This time I don't object to it in that case at all. And in fact, I haven't seen Independence Day in quite a few years. I think I'm going to rent it. I'm going to watch it, tonight or in the next couple of nights, because it's a great story. It's a perfect story for this time of year. We're recording this just before the 4th of July holiday, and we'll play this later in July. But this is a great connection to an important holiday for us, and I think Budweiser is taking good advantage of it.
Yeah, and again, when you watch the film, I think that's the pivotal scene, right? Is when he gives this rallying speech to the country and to the world in a moment where it seems the world, the future of the world, is in doubt. So I think that kind of capitalizing on that, particularly with all of the disarray that we've had in the last couple of years, is kind of like a saying, you know what, this isn't a movie, this is real life. But if we can learn anything from the movies, it's that we can rally together, which I think is a pretty powerful thing. The more I think about it and remember the commercial after having watched it a couple of times, I think the more it really works on a lot of different levels.
Yeah, I agree. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard. He's Howard Eibach.
And he's Henry Gomez. And together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.